Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn d3 takes e4. Knight f6 takes e4. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn f7 to f5. Queen d1 to h5, check. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Bishop b5 takes c6, check. Pawn b7 takes c6. Queen h5 to d1. Queen d8 to h4, check. Pawn g2 to g3. Knight e4 takes g3. Queen d1 to d4. Knight g3 takes h1, check. King e1 to d1. Knight h1 to f2, check. King d1 to e1. Knight f2 to g4, check. King e1 to d1. Rook h8 to g8. Knight g1 to e2. Knight g4 to f2, check. King d1 to e1. Knight f2 to g4, check. King e1 to d2. Bishop f8 to g7. Queen d4 to b4. Pawn a7 to a5. Queen b4 to d6. Bishop g7 to f8. Queen d6 to c7. Bishop c8 to d7. Queen c7 to b7. Rook a8 to a6. Queen b7 takes b8, check. King e8 to e7. Queen b8 to b7. Pawn c6 takes d5. Knight c3 takes d5, check. King e7 to d6. Pawn h2 to h3. Queen h4 takes h3. Queen b7 takes a6, check. King d6 takes d5. Pawn c2 to c4, check. King d5 to c5. Knight e2 to g1. Queen h3 to e3, check. King d2 to d1. Queen e3 takes g1, check. King d1 to d2. Queen g1 to d4, check. King d2 to e1. King c5 to b4. Bishop c1 to d2, check. King b4 to c5. Queen a6 takes a5, check. King c5 takes c4. Queen a5 to c3, check. King c4 to d5. Queen c3 to b3, check. Queen d4 to c4. Queen b3 takes c4, check. King d5 takes c4. Pawn a2 to a4. King c4 to b3. Rook a1 to a3, check. Bishop f8 takes a3. Pawn b2 takes a3. Pawn h7 to h6. King e1 to e2. Bishop d7 takes a4. Bishop d2 to b4. Pawn g6 to g5. King e2 to f3. Bishop a4 to c6, check. King f3 to g3. King b3 to c4. Bishop b4 to d6. Rook g8 to d8. Bishop d6 to b4. Rook d8 to d3, checkmate.